Hey there, everybody. Welcome. I hope I have everything working today. I'm having some technical issues this morning, so I just want to make sure everything is playing all right. So today we are working on this boardwalk through a field of reeds here. It's close by to my apartment, and it occurred to me as I was working on the preparatory drawing that it's my initial thought was that it's going to be about perspective. But as I got into the drawing, it really occurred to me that the benefit to this subject is managing detail and the complexity of the wetlands there. How do you take something that is so incredibly packed with information and distill it into a drawing that is readable without just getting bogged down by all the details? And of course there is some perspective in there, but I think that's the direction I'm going to be taking this lesson today is what do you do with all this stuff and how do you manage those details? So we're going to dig right into it. The image is in the description below the video, as well as links to other resources at artistnetwork.com. So this is Drawing Together. I'm Scott. This is episode 31, so we've got a lot that we've covered, a lot of ground that we've covered. This is another landscape. We haven't done a whole lot of these in the series, but so this was my preparatory sketch based on the reference photo that we're working on today. This is done in charcoal. I have really just my charcoal pencil, some vine charcoal that I'm going to be starting off the drawing with, my two erasers, my kneaded eraser and my rubber eraser, and as well as my trusty shading stumps. Now in this case, I have two of them. I've got one that I've been beating up quite a bit over the last few weeks, and I've got a new one here if I need to switch to that. And the other tool that I'm throwing into the mix is a straight edge. In this case, it's a ruler. You know, it doesn't really matter what you're working with, but I've had a few viewers ask about using straight edges or rulers to help with straight edges, and I want to kind of talk through my process for how and when to use them. So I used them a bit in this preparatory sketch, but just kind of throwing that out there. So if you happen to have one, follow along. I'm also working on a slightly larger piece of paper than normal. So I am working with the Hahnemuhle sketch paper. This is the 190, so it's a pretty heavyweight, smooth surface. This is a larger sheet than what I've been working with, and the dimensions work out to about 11.5 by 16, so a little bit larger. And this image kind of calls for a more horizontal orientation. So I have it taped down to the board, but you can see I have another strip of tape here just to cut off a little bit at the top. I didn't do that in the preparatory one, and I found myself kind of stretching out the subject. So we'll dig right into it. If you have any questions, feel free to call them out in the chat field. I'm going to do my best to monitor them. In the last one, I apologize. There were several questions that I discovered later that I wish I had answered. I missed them in during the live stream. So I get a lot of comments, and sometimes I miss them. So if you want to type them in all caps, that will help me to see them. So if you are working with graphite, I think a lot of these principles will apply. It'll be a little bit harder to do these initial stages, but you can see what I've done here with the charcoal pencils. I've shaved away the wood casing to expose more of that core, and you can do the same with your graphite pencil and follow along many of the same steps. So with the vine charcoal, I'm just going to get started, and I want to start reacting to the scene in front of me. In my mind, what I'm thinking about is how would this all play out if I was on location, if I was in this spot drawing at. As typically a plein air painter, I work a lot on location, and so I'm using this as an opportunity to kind of enhance my drawing skills to hopefully serve me when I'm in the field. And so I'm mentally preparing myself for that and thinking through the drawing as though I was on location. So this is very similar to how I would actually approach a drawing when on location. I'm initially just reacting to the basic perspective. I'm not trying to edit too much at this stage. One of the things I'm noticing is that there's a hard spot on this charcoal I'm going to see if I can illustrate it, but right now I'm actually bearing down on the charcoal and it's not doing a thing. There's a hard spot in there, so if I just rotate it until I find that soft spot, there we go, then the mark appears. So so my eyes are moving quickly back and forth between the reference image that I have here on my tablet in front of me and the drawing. So I'm in a way, what I'm doing is I'm locking my eyes on the subject, on the reference photo, but I'm putting my awareness on the peripheral vision. So I can see my hand moving, and I want that movement to become parallel with the edges that I'm observing. And as I start to lay down marks on the page, I can start to make definitive statements about what needs to happen to those. So I can say, is that angle correct? Does it need to be longer? Does it need to be shorter? Does this distance need to be wider or shorter? But I'm doing this as an evaluation rather than building from some sort of kind of formulaic linear perspective approach. I'm trying to react to the angles that I'm seeing. And you can see that I'm letting my angles run long here. Because I placed this edge here. There's a slight turn right there in the boardwalk. I placed that there, but I don't know if that's correct. I'm just kind of judging it, just kind of reacting to it right now. And then I'm going to go in and start to correct as I gather more information about the subject, as more of the image starts to kind of emerge on the page. And so what I can start to do now is start to feel out the width of the boardwalk. Does it feel like it's remaining fairly consistent there? Do the angles seem to line up? I'm seeing like this feels a bit too steep. The other thing that I'm doing is I have the image projected in front of me right there below the camera. And I can compare that to the drawing, to the reference photo. So you also can do what's called angle sighting. So and you can do this in the field too. So if you close one eye and you hold your pencil out and align it with an edge, you can line it up with the edge and then carry it over to the drawing. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. So if I take this reference, I line my charcoal up with that, carry that across, I can transfer that angle and kind of get something that's pretty close to correct. So in terms of linear perspective, you might be asking yourself about vanishing points, things like that. I try not to concern myself with those things until I find myself in trouble. If something's not coming together, then I start to do things like I trace the vanishing point. I continue this off. I know the rules of linear perspective would suggest that these two edges are parallel, so if you continue them off into the distance, they will appear to converge at a single point on the horizon line. And so I can feel like that's generally happening there. I can feel like this is generally happening as well. So these two are parallel, so if I extend them off, they will converge at a point on that horizon line as well. But one of the things I also want to double check too is I now have these turns in the boardwalk. I have these corners here, and let me see if I take my pencil and if I line them up, I can see, is that relatively horizontal? It feels like it's got a slight angle to it, and that's going to make the whole thing feel like it's a bit wonky. And so I can double check some of these angles here. And if I bring that point down a little bit, that feels a bit more level, more parallel with the top and the bottom edge of the paper. Now this turn here, of course, is cut off here, but if I extend these lines, I should have a similar horizontal orientation between those points. And so I think I need to make some slight changes there. So if it's helpful to you, you might consider drawing this as a square turn and then lopping it off, something like that. But like I said, I think it's helpful to react to the drawing naturally, react to your impression of those angles. I feel like sometimes we lose something in the drawing when it becomes too precise, when it becomes too mechanical. I think really the purpose of drawing is to record our thoughts and record our observations. And when we rely too much on tools and kind of mechanical processes, we lose kind of the life. We lose a sense that there's a mind behind the marks that is making decisions and reacting to the scene. Actually, I'm just going to, this charcoal is giving me some trouble. Might have to grab a new one in a bit. We'll see. So using that as an orientation point, I feel like this is really helpful in providing some sort of structure to the scene. As I mentioned earlier, that this is really what I thought the drawing was going to be about. It was about perspective, but it ultimately becomes about those reeds and the wetlands that this pathway kind of cuts through, and how do we manage all that detail. This helps kind of orient myself to that. I'm going to bring down that line back there a little bit, start to visualize where the break in those wetlands exists. And you can see I'm just utilizing the side of the vine charcoal, blocking in some values. It's kind of a little bit low centered in some of these. There's a bit of a curve to the charcoal, so it's leaving kind of uneven marks, but I don't necessarily need this to be an even value across here. The other thing that you can see can be helpful too is with a stick, instead of utilizing the point, take it on its side like this and practice drawing your lines this way. You'll find that they can be very sharp, very precise, and it engages more of the arm when drawing. So give that a shot. Continue to kind of play around with how you hold the materials, whatever material you're working with. You can do the same if you don't have like a stick to work with. If you're using your pencil to fill in an area, try holding it in an overhand grip like this, and you can move quickly between moving, in broader marks as well as thinner lines. So to kind of play around with that and try to utilize the arm as much as possible. So I'm just kind of filling in some more of the value here, starting to map out some of the larger value shapes. I'm not focusing on detail or anything like that. I'm not even focusing on the texture of the reeds, although it is helpful, I think, to run these marks vertically. There's generally a vertical orientation to the reeds here. But I think what really struck me when doing my preparatory drawing is how satisfying it can be to kind of embrace the abstract nature of this subject and just kind of fall in love with the marks that you're making on the page. And it can be something that is kind of challenging in other subjects, but in this case, I think it works out really well to our advantage to simply simply just kind of embrace the materials. You see that this charcoal has got a few little rough spots and it's leaving kind of scratches in there. So I just need to be careful with that. I don't think it's really hurting the drawing, but I could use that to my advantage. If I know this is going to scratch the heck out of this paper, then I want those scratches to kind of serve me. All right, so this is soft fine charcoal, so I know this is all going to kind of wash away in a bit. I'm not all that concerned by it. This is a lot of really just about kind of orienting myself and reacting to areas, squinting my eyes a lot so I can see the general value in these areas rather than getting bogged down by the individual reeds and such. Keeping the boardwalk fairly light, but I don't want it to be white. All right, so we can start to see that, the ghostly image forming here. All right, what do I want to do now? I don't know if it shows up, but you can kind of see those scratches on there. That's really fascinating. It's kind of etched the surface of the paper a bit, so then it's catching the charcoal. I think that could actually be some really lead to some really interesting effects. So I'm just going to, I think at this point, start to block in some of the larger shapes of values, kind of squinting my eyes. I know I can see enough information that those are cars back there, but I think that's going to be more of a distraction if I actually try to render them as vehicles. I want this to be kind of loose and atmospheric. And then as I work my way down the drawing, I'm going to be thinking more gesturally than optically. So what I mean by that is a gesture is all about reacting to the form in front of you, and kind of latching on to how does that object fill the space? What type of marks, what type of edges are we looking at? Not necessarily what are those specific edges. And so what I can see as I come down the drawing is as we move up to the top, everything gets much finer. They're shorter marks, it's more delicate. As we come forward, these reeds become more prominent, they become more visible. So I'm going to have softer, finer marks in the background, and chunkier marks in the foreground. And so I'm not thinking necessarily about rendering each and every little strand back there. I'm taking some of those big ideas and I'm going to try to let my hand just kind of react to that in that way, and in that way kind of think about it more gesturally, more abstractly. So I'm just like really just kind of short, thin marks, and I'm trying to see some sort of variation in value. It gets really difficult in here, but I start to see a little bit of light across here. I'm looking for the really broad understandings of light and dark. And I think at this point, this is where I need to get rid of the vine charcoal and move to my compressed charcoal stick, because I want some of these marks to be more permanent. So I'm holding it in this kind of overhand grip. Hand's getting all dirty here. If I didn't have this taped down to the board, if I wasn't seated here, what I might do now is get up on top of this and kind of work my way around the drawing. So instead I'm going to try to contort myself a little bit. Start to think through some of these marks back here, these areas where it gets a little bit darker, really kind of fine lines. So I'm really trying to just lock my wrist, drawing more with the shoulder and the elbow. And then as we come up here on this horizon, we see a change in the subject. Now we're moving into these trees. So if I change my marks there, it's a visual indicator for the eye, for the viewer, to say that's a different space, a different subject altogether. So the direction of your marks can really play a big role in how we interpret the subject. And I got to look at that scale too. So I have enough of the ghostly image of the boardwalk here that what I'm doing now is I'm looking at this space here, measuring up, and then seeing, well, what's it directly above that? And I think I have everything kind of shifted over. How do I feel about that? What do I think? I think this needs to be moved over here, this darker mass. Trees needs to be a little bit smaller. Starting to react to just some of those trunks back there. This kind of sets the stage, as it were, for the boardwalk. I don't need that to be very light back there. Got a bunch of trees, and I don't know as if I necessarily want each tree to be, perfectly correct. I don't want to get bogged down there, so I'm going to try to move through this fairly quickly, but I think it's going to be helpful in terms of setting that stage. So essentially I'm working from background to foreground now, and that's something I do typically when I'm painting on location as well, is kind of rough in the foreground so I know where I want that to be, and then jump into that background and move forward. If that background happens to be sky, I'll kind of work on that sky, that horizon line, and kind of go from there. So I just want to keep these marks soft and vertical. keeping them short, not necessarily, I'm not matching the photograph one-to-one. I'm trying to react to the structure of the scene in front of me. And I see some variations in value in here. It gets a little bit darker down in here, where there's, we're kind of looking through the base of the reeds a bit. And then it's almost like a plane, a flat plane across here where the light's catching a little bit more. So I'm trying to see the larger masses of value a little bit more. And right now I'm just trying to feel out what makes sense in terms of the approach I'm taking, how I'm holding the pencil. If I hold it like this, like more like a tripod writing grip, it works out all right, but I find myself creating this natural kind of curve because I'm pivoting around that wrist, and I don't think I like that. It's lending itself to the marks that are too consistent, too even, so I'm going to break that up. So this is going to be a really good example of what the ugly duckling stage looks like. And I've talked about that before in the series, is the idea that I've learned to get comfortable with the idea that every drawing goes through an ugly duckling stage, where you're like, I don't know if this is going to come together, this is not looking right, it just looks like visual chaos, visual confusion. And so this is definitely going to be one of those. And I love that, and to some degree. I love that sense you almost have to fight for your drawing to kind of reel it back in. And of course, it can get frustrating when it doesn't quite do that. But that's I think what is going to be illustrated here. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of mess, and then hopefully we reel it back in to give it some sort of order and understanding. So, think about the visual process. When I was in this location, I didn't stop to look at every single reed there. You take it all in, and your brain starts to fill in the rest. It takes in all that visual information, and then it extracts from that what is most essential for you. And typically, it's not about seeing each and every blade of grass or every stalk in the wetlands here. It's taking the whole thing. It's about the space. It's about the environment. And so I think I want my drawing to kind of reflect that idea. So one of the things I'm doing is also, as I'm making my marks, I'm trying to kind of rock them a little bit so that I'm not creating hard edges. I'm just kind of getting a sense for, again, reacting gesturally to the flow of the reeds here. I'm going to look for questions here. Barbara's asking what pencil I am using. This is a General's Charcoal. This is a 4B, I believe. Everybody from all over the place. I love seeing where everybody's from. So if you haven't already, I'd love to see what, where you're viewing from. We've seen people come in from all over the world. So what you may have already observed me do is play out the scale of the marks in these initial gestures. Bigger, longer marks here in the foreground. And then as we scoot across here, so we have almost this wall of reeds here, and then we look across that plane at the tops of them. And so when we look here in the reference image, if I bring that down, looking here in the reference images, that's really close to us. You go up just a fraction of an inch, and all of a sudden now what you're looking at up here is very far away. It could be a couple hundred yards away, and then those cars back there. So in the vertical space of the page, we're moving back quite a bit. And so the way we adjust our marks is going to help to convey that. So if I tighten up my marks back in here, hopefully that'll feel more distant. Then I open them up, make them bigger, stronger here in that foreground, but I think what I want to do is kind of lock that background in first, and then build those foreground elements on there. So kind of building up values, and we haven't even gotten into any of the negative drawing that we're going to be doing. So the eraser is going to be playing a prominent role in this whole drawing here. So just kind of keeping this light. Try to avoid overly consistent marks, and that's a natural tendency for all of us, is to to go through and go and make these evenly spaced. And so what I try to force myself to do is work in these small chunks. So I'll kind of make a few quick marks, rotate a little bit, make a few other quick marks, and try to keep that variation going there. All right. Let's see. I think what I need to do is actually I'm going to do a little bit of negative drawing to create definition on there. So in a few key areas, I'm just going to kind of sharpen up that edge. And hopefully I'll find that right balance between defining it sufficiently and versus kind of too much. It's such an atmospheric edge along there. I want this drawing to kind of capture that sense in the space, is that we see kind of generally a line there, but it's all very subtle. So just kind of thinking through a little bit more. And I'm trying not to think too much about what these shapes actually are back there. There's a lot of weeds and trees and bushes back in there. But I don't want to tell myself exactly what they are. I just want to react to them as abstract shapes. And I did find something that, when I make marks like this, when I'm kind of flicking the wrist and down, it creates this natural curve. You can see that pivot. But I find that when I flick upwards, it doesn't happen as much. So I don't know if that's going to be true for any of you if you're following along, but I need to remind myself as I'm starting to observe kind of this curve in my marks, I want to keep that varying, because what can sometimes happen is a fairly subtle arc when I'm going like this. If I build the whole drawing with that, next thing I know, when I step back from it, everything has this kind of curve to it. And so I want to shake that up a little bit and make sure that if I am making marks with those natural curves to them, that they're not dominating the whole drawing. They're just kind of small portions within it. So hopefully that is enough right in there to kind of define, and doing some negative drawing to define that horizon edge. Looking at the image in front of me there, I feel like it's starting to capture kind of this nice atmosphere that I'm pleased with. Utilizing just the side of the pencil in these areas. I don't need a sharp edge, but that negative drawing helps to define that. And I think there's enough texture back in here that I can it'll read as distant reads rather than being up close. But if I just kind of, so what I have here, my rubber eraser, is I've sanded it down. So just on a flat sheet of sanding paper, I cleaned off all the edges and I sharpened up the edges. And I also I took a razor blade and I shaved it down to that point there. And that's going to help me with some negative drawing later on. But you can see as I kind of tap, if I keep these just short and light, again thinking gesturally, these marks are just softer and more fine. It can start to do some kind of negative drawing and suggest some of the reads that are more in the distance. One of the things that I always say is that you're always contributing to the form. So the eraser isn't a tool just for correcting mistakes. It's another tool to actually contribute to the form. So that's what I'm doing here. And I'm just thinking about that very distant plane of reeds there, and I want to lock them in there. So I'm also looking for those areas of light and dark. Again, there's this kind of band of light right across in here. Kind of change up the direction. This is all very light, and just kind of more tapping than anything. And if you need to pull off a little bit more, just give it a quick kind of shake. A little vibration is enough to create those forms. And so this is the part where drawing itself starts to take over, and you can kind of fall in love with just the mark making, but make sure that it's also in service of the space of the drawing, that you're continuing to pay attention to what's happening in the scene. So it's so easy just to get kind of immersed in the kind of the sensuous nature of the charcoal, but I'm still moving my eyes quickly back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing. And I'm liking the texture that's forming over there. So it might be a little bit hard to see. So let me see what happens if I can zoom in a little bit. I can't quite. I don't know if that helps at all to see some of those little eraser marks. R.S. Hooper, if you want to change that background, go right ahead. That's what this whole the whole point of, I think, of these drawing together series is to just kind of use these as starting points. To kind of build skill and do whatever you kind of like from there. So go for it. There's no hard and fast rule about what you can and can't do. All right. So I think I've got that background established enough that I can start working in the foreground, and I can always go back in there if I need something more. But again, I want to push that back. I don't want to over render it. Now I want to put all my focus on here. So this is where I can start to bring out the ruler and show you how I utilize it. If I'm happy with this overall angle here, what I want to try to not do is draw one hard consistent line. That's really going to jump out, and it's going to feel unnatural, and it may impact how we interpret this as being an object in space. So what I instead want to do is, let me see. I want to see how this shading stump works. I'm looking at just that thin shadow on that back ridge. And I'm going to try to build something up there. There's a little thin strip of light right there on top of it that I can then, I can utilize this edge to help establish. Just kind of quick kind of vibrations, but I'm kind of tapping my way around it into it. I want to make sure that it's not reading as too heavy of a line. Now I've got that thin strip across there, and what I want to do is essentially mask that off now, and I'm going to start doing some negative drawing of those reeds back there. So this is where I can start to kind of bring back that gestural mark making, thinking about the scale of those reeds that I'm seeing in that distance and the general shapes of light and dark. Just kind of letting the pencil skip across the page. I don't like that grip, so I'm going to switch to this overhand. So I'm letting it kind of roll and kind of flick across the page, kind of just skipping there. There is some tooth to the paper, that's helping as well. Let me see, what do I want to do? I can't really quite get the mark that I want. I think I want to do this now. It's not quite working either. There we go. I think I've kind of masked that off sufficiently. Let's see. I think there's more down here. I just want to be really kind of careful. I don't want to overstate anything. And I'm finding that this is working a little bit better to use the shorter end of where that's sharpened. but instead of using the point, I'm just kind of scraping it up on the side. I want marks that really feel kind of natural. So it's actually what's happening is I'm marking up the page on the wood here and just kind of gradually rocking it up like this. And so it's kind of, I'm kind of pantomiming the motion with just the wood kind of leaning on the paper. And then I'm just kind of leaning into it when I need to. And that starts to create some of these finer lines that add a little bit of detail, again, without getting kind of bogged down. So I'm just kind of trying to let my marks kind of just react to the scene in front of me. And so then what I hope will happen just by masking off that edge there, it's going to feel more natural. It's going to feel like it's pushing back in there. And like right in here, I'm kind of losing it a little bit, so I can do some negative drawing in here. Because what can happen is if I draw too heavy of a line, that's just going to pop forward in a way that I think could be destructive to the space in the drawing. So I want to keep that fairly subtle and then allow the viewer's eye to complete that path there. I think we have often a tendency to want to draw a line to define an edge, and that can be helpful in some areas, but you can also create an edge this way. When I did that first drawing, I didn't use the ruler initially, and I found that it was giving me trouble. And so I kind of pulled that out, and I'm like, yeah, I really like the way this is working. So, all right, so bringing the edge of my eraser back in, and so I'm kind of giving it a little bit of a squeeze that makes it, gives it kind of a camber to it. And so just using that edge, I'm kind of tapping, and I can see that some of those reeds are kind of folded over. So I can start to mimic that a little bit. And one of the things that I notice as well is that those bent over reeds are generally light. They're catching the light a bit more than the vertical ones. And so I can start to pay attention to that, and I'm not necessarily drawing the entire reed, but maybe these just represent just the top portions of those bent over kind of reeds there. And then those are kind of middle ground, and then we have these ones in the foreground. They're going to be larger reeds. And I'm feeling kind of a curve to them, so I want to break that up a little bit. And then let me see. I think what I need to do is sharpen it. So what I've noticed too is that on the boardwalk along those rails, you have a top side that's light. You have the vertical edges that are in shadow, and then you have a thin line underneath them that are darker, and that's what helps to create a sense of three-dimensionality. And so I want to suggest that back in here. So just a really thin line, but I want to break that up, kind of tap along that edge, and that hopefully is enough to kind of sharpen that up without it really jumping off the page too much. And then reeds are going to be overlapping here. I can come down here to this foreground one, again, where I have kind of light striking that top rail. That's not the right angle. Bring that down a little bit. I don't like that, so let me try that again. Let me see if I can approach it this way. There's that light across that top rail. We have a value there. The sides. Let me see. I think what I need to do is I also need to define this back edge along in here. And so then what I have is this kind of triangular form. I see a little bit of light. There's a thin sliver. So instead of the charcoal, I'm going to use this shading stump. Did that do anything? Not really. I'm going to check that on the screen. Kind of in a way stepping back from the drawing. So I'm going to, when I'm drawing those lines back here, I'm just going to go right over that edge, and then I'm going to cut this back out right on top of it when I need to. And I think that's going to make for a better edge. Let's see, there's this little dark piece in here. And what's nice is that this scene, there's only a few areas where there's kind of a structure to it. And so I want to make sure that I address those properly. So like this bridge provides structure in this field of craziness. What I can do here is I can mask this and now draw that background. I want to be careful about those lines. And then see how that feels. Let's see. And then I take this. I can erase out that upper rail. Let's see. And then there's a turn over here. There's some shadow. Trying to keep my light lines a little bit lighter there. You see how I'm looking at that line, I'm like, ugh, it feels too mechanical. So I've given myself that as a guide. I don't feel like it's quite right, but I feel like perhaps it's okay. So let me see what happens if I've got it on there, but I would rather it feel more natural. Build up some charcoal there. Let me just use my kind of shading stump. Now I kind of have that line as a way to, as a bit of a guide. But yeah, that dark edge is starting to bother me. Dark edge there, so I want to get rid of that. Shading it out. Now I'm going to redo that light edge across here, across the top. So a lot of drawing is about moving back and forth. So I feel better about that mark. There's some variation in there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of three primary values here. There's a light hitting the top, then there's a shadow on the side, and then there's a kind of a thinner dark edge underneath. And so I want to kind of learn my lesson from before and not make one long swoop. I want to kind of tap this line together, thinking about areas where maybe it's a bit more dominant, more visible, and areas where it's not. Maybe a little bit lighter and across back in here. Just try to vary that up a little bit, and I think that's going to read as being more natural. Okay, so that gives me a little bit of structure there, and so I can now move through the rest of the drawing. Again, I'm just kind of masking off the boardwalk here, and I'm going to start to draw in these reeds here. And so in general, what I'm noticing is, like, again, that with the bend in the reeds, the light seems to catch the reeds where they bend. They move in a different direction other than vertically. The vertical edges tend to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to start to kind of place in some of these vertical edges. Again, trying to think about the general flow of the pencils, of the reeds there, and allow my pencil to kind of move across there. And then, just kind of get a feeling for the push and the pull. So when you're making your marks, what's the difference between this? Like I'm making the mark on the upswing versus the downstroke. And I feel like that's a bit more effective. I'm essentially holding it like this. You can see how dirty my fingers are getting. They're rubbing against the surface of the paper. And I'm trying to vary my marks. I'm seeing how the reeds kind of clump together in a way in these areas of almost these kind of triangular areas. So when I did the initial drawing, I didn't mask it off to begin with, mask off the boardwalk, and then ended up with a result that I think it worked out all right, because if you overlap that mark, if you let these lines run long, you can always use your eraser to kind of cut that back out. But you can start to see that texture forming here. I started to create that. I kind of extended it a bit too far here. I think it's really dark in here. One of the things I also do is I'm rolling the pencil as I'm going, always getting kind of a fresh edge. It may be hard to see in the video here, and I like there's this strand right up here that gets a little bit bigger. I like that. All right. Nell, no rulers for you. That's a good challenge for you. Again, like I said, I didn't do the first one. I didn't use the rulers until kind of the end, and I wanted to see how would that work. And then, so if you're not, again, just get comfortable, drawing with your full arm. Just checking here. What brand of rubber eraser? I honestly don't know. I sanded it down, so I've lost the imprint on it. I think this is a Staedtler eraser, but I can't be positive. I need to get... Just trying to change up my marks a little bit here as I go. And then one of the things that you can do is also observe that the difference in depth here. We're moving back in space as we go along that back edge, so making them even a little bit larger here, making the marks larger here, a little bit finer, smaller down as we recede away. But I just, this is where I love just the feel of the charcoal and kind of embrace the mark making. Kind of trust the materials to provide the visual information that we need, rather than feeling the pressure to render everything and be super explicit with what's being drawn, as though the viewer wouldn't be able to piece it together. I think there's sometimes a kind of a lack of trust that the marks that we make will be readable, and so then we kind of go to the extreme of drawing every strand. So just drawing that a little, just doing some hand drawing in here. Keep it lighter and looser. All right, what do I want to do now? Kneaded eraser time, I think, is what I want to do, is pull out some of the light across this surface across here. And this is where I can start to pay attention to the boards. There's a kind of a slight angle. As we move up towards the back, we know that this becomes horizontal here, but connecting those 2 points in the turn. So we can make kind of horizontal marks there. As we come down, kind of angle them up just a little bit, and that helps with the perspective. It's not very visible, but it's starting to add a little bit of texture there. Let's see how this kneaded eraser does. This is kind of a fun experiment. So I'm just taking my kneaded eraser, kind of filing it down into these fins. We're done on time. Get a feel for, again, the push and the pull of the mark. Like, does it feel better to you to pull the eraser and those marks that it makes, or does it feel better to push it? Just be careful of squiggles. I think there's also a tendency, like I said, there's a tendency to create regularly spaced marks, but there's also a tendency to create squiggles, to go like that, and create these kind of S-curves that I think can be difficult. I just did it right there. So just be careful with that. What I love about charcoal is you can see I can just wipe that back out. Okay, so I'm suggesting some of those forms a little bit tighter back in here. Kind of go back. I want to see if is it reading as creating space there. I think I need a little bit more depth along this edge here. So I don't want to create a line that runs across. You can even see that that edge is broken. You know, that doesn't quite line up as I follow along that edge, and I'm going to leave that. I think I want to trust that. You know, our eye will kind of piece that together, and I think it's going to feel more comfortable optically to have that edge be broken up. Like I said, if you follow along these lines, there's places where they don't quite line up. And I'm going to evaluate that later to see if that's actually creating a desired effect. All right, so now I can come back in here. Actually, I think I need to create a little bit of definition back in here. Shorter marks as we're distant here. Here we go. And then I can kind of tap out some of these highlights. And again, the light seems to be catching on the ones that are broken down that kind of have that angle to them. Don't throw your eraser. So I'm just utilizing the side kind of corner of the eraser. And if I need a shorter mark, what I do is I bend it like this to create a kind of a finer point of contact on the page. And I'm not worried about making sure that these marks match one-to-one with the reference photo. Again, this is about kind of reacting to the space and understanding the kind of the essence of the space here. You see what happens if I do this. This is just the shading stump. Just kind of creating some additional texture, and it's a little bit softer of a mark that I hope will provide somewhat of a middle value. So those really dense, dark marks that I have on there will hopefully read as the darkest shadow parts. And then some of these softer marks will hopefully create some more of a three-dimensional quality to it. So this is a lot about, again, not kind of just working through in chunks rather than getting lost and doing a series of marks that are all identical. So here, I think I'm not worrying about preserving that edge anymore. Going right over that edge. And when I'm doing this, again, as I'm going, I'm kind of rolling that shading stump to give me a fresh edge there. I feel like there's a more defined kind of a darker edge along in here. That'll help to pull that forward and create some light across there. If I start working in the background, I need to tighten up these marks a little bit. Make it softer. Now here, this jumps forward in space so I can get chunkier with it. How are we feeling about that? Oh, Karen, a good question about whether to use the kneaded eraser or the rubber eraser. I would give them both a kind of a taste to see what you feel about it, and then ask yourself what kind of result are you getting out of that? Is the mark reading the way you wanted it to? So what happened for me is that I found like that the kneaded eraser was creating too soft of a mark, so I went to the rubber eraser, which gave it just a little bit sharpness to it, because I can create an edge like that I think works a bit more effectively. And right there, like I've got this kind of blur, so I can do some negative drawing, kind of sharpen that reflection off a little, or that highlight off a little bit. And so it may look like I'm just kind of randomly doing stuff, but I'm still continuing to look back and forth between the reference photo and my drawing. I'm trying to react to what I'm observing. So even if it doesn't match one-to-one, I want there to be intention behind the marks so that they feel observed, if that makes sense. What I want to avoid is again just kind of embracing the mark making so much that it no longer references the subject. So now I can come back in here. Just kind of tapping along. The side of the pencil can give you some really fine marks, and so you don't need to use the point quite as much. So just adding a little bit of kind of sharpness in here in terms of value. It creates a bit of a focal point right in there. Again, just kind of reacting to what I'm seeing in front of me, trying not to calculate too much, but what's more important to me is that the scale of the marks reflect the scale of the perspective, the scale of the reads given the distance and the perspective. All right, so that feels pretty good there. I can build up some value in here, start to work my way through the drawing. M. Phelps is asking about the hardness of the pencil. So this is a 4B, I believe. To be honest, I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that. If I had a 6B, I think it would generally come out about the same. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're wondering if there's something that's preferred. Not really as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Now what I need to do is, let's see, I'm going to come back in and add the texture to that later. So what I'd like to do now is establish this. I love how these reeds come in on top, and so that edge of the boardwalk comes in and out of view, and then we lose that corner over there. And so I want to be able to visualize where that corner should be so that I have a decent sense of perspective, kind of giving myself some orientation marks. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my negative drawing here. Kind of these short vertical marks kind of leading up to that edge. So rather than drawing a continuous line, thinking about the areas where it kind of comes into view a little bit more, where it gets a little bit darker. I can feel that curve in my mark, so I need to change that up. And maybe I need to mask this off here as well. So I'm just keeping these marks fairly light. Generally vertical here to kind of reflect the flow of the reeds here. All right. So if anybody watched the bird recording that I posted as part of the series, that would have been on Memorial Day. That bird was sitting right off to the right here. I took both the photos essentially at the same time. So this is a photo that I've taken. We talked a bit about that in the last one, about utilizing reference photos. So sometimes I go to a site called Pixabay to find a photo that works. But whenever I can, I try to use my own photo references. So, okay, so here what we want to do is I want to kind of establish the railing there. So I'm just kind of giving myself some light lines as a guide to figure out where that is, because in the photo it's very difficult to see the change in value and to see that edge there. What really makes that edge pop is that shadow cast on this rail down in here. So there's a kind of a line across there. That felt like it was too far. There's that short vertical edge. I'll do that. I just want to kind of tap along in a few areas here to establish that rough guide without really rendering that line completely. Actually, I think I want to utilize this. What I want to do is I'm going to mask this bottom edge. It's not really working. I don't have enough charcoal. So I'm drawing these as just short vertical marks to reference that edge. You can see I'm not being very careful with that top edge. I'm just kind of masking that bottom, because then I can come back in and with my eraser kind of erase this down. And that feels a bit more natural. I can establish the light across this top rail as well. And then I kind of lost some of that form here, kind of over erased a little bit. But so that's typically how I utilize a straight edge, is I try to use it as a guide and more as this form of masking than anything. Actually, I feel like that's a bit too, I need to make this rail a little bit larger, like this. And I try to use that as a guide more than anything, because I don't want those marks to feel too unnatural, if that makes sense. So let me know if you have any questions about that. So that's feeling a little bit better, but you can see now that railing is essentially established through the placement of that shadow, and then there's that thin, dark edge, because that is raised off the surface a bit. And I'm just kind of moving. I want to break that edge up a bit. So I'm moving the moving the ruler as I go. So hopefully that feels a bit more naturalistic. Like I said, I rather than one continuous line, I want to feel like that's kind of more broken. All right. Thank you for sticking with me. I'm going to continue on this. So I'm just checking here for any questions. Let's see, how do you get such a sharp white line with the eraser? It's a good question. So you can see how this is already getting gummed up. When I started this drawing, it was pure white. I had sanded it down, and that created these sharper edges along here. Now that it's building up some charcoal, it's going to smudge a bit more. So as you can see along here, this is just a light pressure, and it's smudging more than anything. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll take a pass at these reeds in the foreground. And see what happens with the eraser. And you can see it kind of just, it's smudging more than anything now. And when I need more, it's just kind of leaning into it. And so I've got, because I have 4 edges on this eraser, I've got potentially 4 sharp edges plus this top edge that I've shaved down. So I haven't gotten to that top edge yet. So I'm just trying to react, again, trying to think about generally about the form, but I'm trying not to become too consumed by the idea of trying to make it precise. So you can see how that with the shading stump, it allows this kind of transparency to take place where the we can still see the that boardwalk through there, but but the reeds are also coming in on top. You have to kind of see through both of them. There's a transparency that's happening. Maybe come back in here and draw some darker lines. Again, not using the tip. I'm just kind of using the wood, the casing to kind of help me to create some marks. And when I need a darker mark, I just kind of lean in to it. So I'm establishing some of the darkest areas in here. I'm going to come back in on top with the highlights and on top of that. So and again, practicing, kind of in this case, I'm making the marks on the downstroke, and then play around with it on the upstroke as well. Similar to playing guitar or something like that. There can be a slight difference to the tone of a sound you make when you do a downward pluck versus an upward kind of flick with a pick. So this is where, again, my eye is moving very quickly back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing, and I'm trying to react in a very gestural way to what I'm seeing. And I think there's a few in here that I want to make more defined. Switch back to this, see how this works. So hopefully that answered your question. What's the best way to be sure we're capturing foreground versus background areas so they have the right perspective? So again, that kind of goes back to the scale of the marks. So allowing in a gestural way us to react to the scene, knowing that these are farther more distant, they're just lighter, it's kind of softer, finer, tighter packed marks here. As we come forward, we can make bigger, bolder, stronger marks. And so even if they don't match the reference photo one-to-one, the viewer will react to these and will understand these as being closer. And especially having a kind of, again, marks in the foreground and marks in the background to refer to, if we see these as being big, those as being small, we're going to interpret those as being closer to us. So hopefully that makes sense. There is a bit of a value shift as well. So maybe the darkest areas are preserved for that foreground. Generally in a landscape, the darker values kind of fall off as we recede, as it gets as that's the space between us gets flooded with atmosphere. It tends to knock down the contrast. So the whites aren't quite as crisp, the darks aren't quite as dark in that background, and so you can do that in a subtle way as well. So I'm seeing that there's kind of there's a natural fold to some of these areas in here. I'm really scratching this paper too, which is kind of fun. I don't know if anybody's seen the drawings of Frank Auerbach, but man, those are exciting. You know, he really gets onto the paper, and you'll see some where he bore down on it so hard that he's actually ripped a hole in it, and then he's got to come back in with another piece of paper either underneath it or on top of it, and he just keeps going. But that gets really exciting sometimes to see stuff like that. All right. I'm loving the marks that happen there, and that's, you can see what's happened to this wood pencil. I'm drawing with that now. It's kind of picking up that charcoal, and I'm just kind of rocking it from the wood to the tip of the pencil. And I don't know if, you know, when I started this drawing, I imagined that I would have needed, you know, 100 of these sharpened charcoal sticks that I could just keep grabbing and always having a sharp point. And then when I did that initial drawing, I stayed with that one the whole time, because I found that I wasn't really utilizing the point in a way that we normally think of drawing, you know, fine detail and lines. And I was using the edge, and so I'm constantly kind of rolling it in my fingers. All right, so now that we get down here, I'm going to need to establish that perspective. Again, I'm just going to kind of lightly scribe that line. There's some natural texture in the wood that I want to preserve, so I'm not really bearing down too much. I'm trying to let some of that tooth of the paper carry some of that texture there. And there's my shading stump. I need to establish this shadow along in here. That is incorrect. Let's see, what do I want to do about that? I think I want to... So this distance is too far. What do I want to do about that? I kind of like it. I think I'm just going to leave it the way it is. So hopefully you can see that in the reference photo here. You see how short that is. Here's what I don't like about it. It just kind of clicked for me. I think the angle feels off somehow. I think I need to bring that down a little bit. That angle is going to be more critical than anything, because I don't want that boardwalk to feel wonky. And then actually, since I'm doing that, maybe I will correct the depth of it. So what happens is I need to bring that edge of the boardwalk up a little bit. Mask that off. This gets really dark down in here. I am not being careful here. That's all right. Just making a mess, and that is fun. All right, here, now we go like this. Bring that on top, and that feels better to me. Maybe not 100% correct. That line bothers me because it is too strong. So what I will do is kind of knock that down. I'm going to mask this off, and I can start to create some of that texture across here. So just utilizing the shading stump that happens to have charcoal on it. This is kind of creating that wood grain. Actually, what I want to do is go right over that edge. I think I'm creating too much of a halo there. And then what we can do, kind of erase out in some areas. Trying to keep that loose because it's very textural. And then maybe I'm going to define this edge a little bit more. Just hand drawing it there because I don't want that line to be too rigid. Now the same with some of these lines here that represent the boards. Kind of similar to teeth. It's not about drawing each and every tooth in the mouth. It's not about drawing each and every board in this boardwalk. What you're trying to do is suggest that a little bit. I'm looking at trying to match the angles a little bit and let the viewer's eye kind of fill in that detail. Because if you overstate, if you draw every little board on there, that's going to overwhelm the drawing. If you squint at the reference photo, all those individual boards kind of disappear. The lines between them kind of disappear. And then we just know with a kind of linear perspective that they get tighter, closer together as we recede. So I'm just trying to suggest that a little bit more than really define it. So hopefully you're not getting bogged down in the details and really trying to, again, render every board. We're trying to create an impression of this. We're trying to just react to it. Okay. Let's see, I've filled that in now. I feel like I need to get in here with the eraser and start to define some of these lighter pieces here that you can see really kind of folded up into kind of a nest over here. And so what happened is I got some nice clean marks, and then it started to pick up charcoal, and then it just started to smudge. So then maybe I'll rotate to a kind of a fresh edge of the eraser. And if I take too much away, like I did here, now I've got that big chunk of white. I can come back in with my other tools and start to give it a bit more structure there. But I'm kind of feeling like I just, sometimes in a drawing like this, you can just fall in love with the marks themselves. And it's starting to happen. Sometimes I just, I just like what's happening with the charcoal there, and I kind of want to be careful not to overwork it. There, I like that. That provided a little bit of variation in there. See what happens there. So I'm just using my palm to kind of smudge a little bit. So this was way, like I said at the beginning of this video, this is not the direction I initially intended on going when I took this reference photo. Again, I thought this was all going to be about perspective and that boardwalk. And then as I got into it yesterday, I realized that that's not at all. Like the really what's visually interesting to me is managing that detail and utilizing this as an opportunity to really just to kind of explore mark making. So even if this just comes out to be a complete mess, hopefully what it's doing for you is giving you an opportunity to develop and just develop a kind of your visual language. Playing around with just the opportunities for varying marks that the material provides you, whether it's charcoal, whether it's graphite, or something else. I think something like this, it's so overwhelming in that detail. It kind of forces you to kind of rely on the materials to do a certain amount of work for you. And then as you become more comfortable with that, you can roll that out into other drawings as well, and try to make it so that you feel like it's a really kind of more of a relationship between you and the materials rather than a situation where you're completely controlling the material and having it do exactly what you want. Sometimes the charcoal just does fun stuff on the page, and sometimes the paper itself will kind of force you to move in a certain direction and kind of force your hand in a way. And so play around with different papers, play around with different materials. Oh, I like that. So that's not something that's in the reference photo, but I feel like what that does, it provides focal point. It's closer, and it helps to reinforce that depth. So hopefully this is giving you some ideas on ways you can just play around with charcoal. I think what I'd like to do is kind of define that edge a little bit more here. Kind of just, now I'm scanning the drawing to see how everything holds up. Does it feel all right? I feel like that boardwalk is a little wonky. But it should be, I think perhaps it's okay. I don't know. Maybe it's all right. It's a man-made structure that's been sitting out in the elements for a while, so maybe it's got a little twist to it. So let me see. I'm going to check it for any questions here. Consider doing a tortoise turtle. That's a good idea. I will give that a shot, actually. So I actually have an opportunity to take my own reference photo there. So, but I think that's about it. I'm going to kind of hang on for a little bit farther to see if you have any additional questions. So this is Drawn Together. Again, we meet every Monday, Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Check out artistnetwork.com. There are links in the description below. We're going to find additional resources for drawing. And you can find the individual show pages. I know there was a question early on about that. But so if you go to artistnetwork.com, there's a link in the description that takes you to the Drawing Together page. And on that page, you're going to see a list of all the individual episodes. You click on each of those episode pages, and it takes you to a dedicated page where you'll see the video, as well as a chat field in which people have posted images or shared comments. And so it's been really awesome to see the work that you all have posted. Just a kind of tremendous fun. And many of you have been posting a whole group in the series, so you've been doing, certainly more than one of these drawings, and that's been really exciting to see. I know for me, the whole point of this was to take this time when so many of us are at home to improve my skills for when I feel more comfortable being outside and back into plein air painting more. And I have really kind of fallen back in love with drawing, and I think it's just building my confidence from when I'm painting, because it does that in the way that it helps you to build your intuition about perspective and proportion. You react to things more quickly the more you draw. And so even with a brush and paint and with pigment, it's a very different material. It'll help me to see things more quickly. So I want to thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a beautiful weekend. It sounds like some of you are in for some rough weather this weekend, or later this week, so be safe. Hopefully you can take all of this visual chaos, kind of immerse yourself in drawing, and just have fun with it. So thank you so much. M. Phelps is asking, do I draw figures? It's been a long time. I've got a few kind of quick portrait videos in here, but I haven't done much with figurative work in a long time. I used to do that a lot. So especially in college, there's a lot of figure drawing that is kind of requirement. So I would do that, and I would also do that when I would teach drawing. And I thoroughly enjoyed, especially gestural work. So when I do work with figures, it's often on location, and it's with very quick gestural kind of capturing the form. So thank you so much. It looks like we've got all the questions answered. So I'm going to sign off for today. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. I got to go clean up. I am wicked dirty now, so I'm going to go wash my hands, figure out if I'm going to continue to work on this or not. But I think we've taken it as far as we need to today. So thank you. Have a great rest of the week. Lynn, so no topic for this Friday. We're going Mondays and Wednesdays Our hope is on Tuesdays to go to Facebook as well. So potentially 3 drawings next week, but one of them would be our Facebook page on Artist Network. Glad to hear you're enjoying it, Barb. Thank you, everybody. A lot of good feedback here. Look forward to seeing you all again.